In the 2011 draft, the Utah Jazz were fortunate enough to have the number 3 pick in the draft despite it being an otherwise fairly underwhelming class, and while they could have taken guys like Klay Thompson, Jonas Valanciunas, Kemba Walker, Nikola Vucevic, Tobias Harris, among others, they chose to select the big man who was the top 10 recruit in high school of that class of 2010 in Enes Kanter, now Enes Freedom. And it's still weird for me to call a player by their new name when they change names halfway through their career, so for the purposes of this video, you're going to hear me call Enes Kanter, even though yes, I'm aware he legally changed his last name to Freedom. But in any event, Enes Kanter went on to have a fairly underwhelming career in the NBA. I wouldn't say it was the worst career that a top 3 pick could have, because we've had plenty of other truly busted draft picks that were in the top 3 over the years, but he definitely didn't live up to the player the Utah Jazz thought he would become, and they in fact traded him just before his rookie contract was up to the Oklahoma City Thunder before he signed a big contract extension with them. And while Kanter certainly had success at the NBA level for a few seasons, he was one of the top rebounders in the league, could get you a double-double on a nightly basis, but Kanter was an absolute liability on the defensive end, so much so that if his offense wasn't working, he was oftentimes unplayable for a guy who was making near max money at the time that the Oklahoma City Thunder gave him that contract extension. And of course, with some injuries, off-court matters, which I'll talk about, sidelined him from playing, and his game started to taper off to the point where he was out of the league by 2022 after he was waived by the Houston Rockets last February. And ever since then, Enes Kanter has been barking about how the NBA pushed him out of the league because of his criticism towards the Chinese government, and how he's clearly good enough to still be playing in the NBA. And it's gotten to the point that even over a year after being waived, he is now looking to sue the NBA for effectively ending his career and not allowing teams to sign him, claiming that he is going to expose the league's hypocrisy with a smile on his face. And while I get the frustration and can understand why Kanter is upset for not being able to get a contract with an NBA team, sometimes players just need a reality check and realize that maybe they just aren't good enough to be playing basketball at the highest level in their profession anymore, and maybe that's the reason why no team wants to sign them. And that's what I'll be discussing in this video. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy this type of content, then feel free to subscribe and hit that notification bell, and in return I'll be providing more NBA content like this all season long. Now, the story of Enes Kanter and his path to the NBA was somewhat unique in the sense that he grew up in Turkey, started playing basketball professionally in Turkey by the time he was 16, and then moved to the United States to play high school basketball as a senior to get exposure and visibility in the US in front of scouts and obtain a high school recruiting rank. He then gets ranked 7th among all high school recruits in the class of 2010. He signs a letter of intent to play basketball for Kentucky, but then was deemed ineligible because he was still receiving payment from his professional team in Turkey, and at that time college athletes were not allowed to obtain any kind of pay. Thus, he ends up not playing college, continues playing professionally overseas until he eventually gets drafted in 2011 by the Utah Jazz. Now, it took Kanter a bit to really start finding his footing in the NBA. Didn't play very well in his rookie and sophomore seasons. Then in his third year, finally started stringing together consistent games where he would have big offensive nights, but it was becoming pretty clear for the Utah Jazz that Kanter probably wasn't the best choice to be taking that high in the draft, and while he had some value with his improved play going into his third and fourth seasons, they decided to move on from him instead of signing him to an extension by moving him to the Oklahoma City Thunder. Kanter then went on to have some of his best years with the Thunder alongside Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook, but despite being a decently good offensive player, Kanter, as I mentioned, was absolutely terrible on the defensive end. He simply could not stay on his man, was atrocious at guarding the pick and roll, would always get lost in knowing where he needed to be, and despite his size, would get bullied in the post by guys smaller than him. Kanter, for a good portion of his career, had one of the worst defensive ratings and defensive box plus minuses in the NBA for qualified players. And although his offense was decent, it didn't make up for how bad his defense was. In fact, for most of his career, he was a net negative on the floor because of his defense alone. Like, I know a lot of people will say, wow, there are a lot of bad defenders out there in the NBA. Guys can barely play defense anymore. Why are we singling Kanter out? Well, Kanter was especially bad, having worse defensive ratings than guys like James Harden, Steph Curry, even Trae Young. And the difference between those guys and their poor defense is that Kanter was not an elite level offensive player. It would be one thing to be really bad on defense, but then give your team 25-11 on offense. Now, I'm sure some are wondering, well, what exactly happened off the court that got Enes Kanter to this point to where he feels like the NBA has has blacklisted him from playing. Well, as most of you know, Kanter is actually a very outspoken person when it comes to his politics and activism away from basketball, which first of all, I think is great. I take no issue with players using their platform to speak out about issues that they are passionate about, as long as it doesn't marginalize a population or is downright racist or prejudiced in nature. But back in 2021, Kanter condemned the president of China, saying he was a, quote, brutal dictator, and expressed his support for the Free Tibet movement. Now, Kanter was playing for the Boston Celtics at the time, and as a result, the Chinese government retaliated by no longer streaming all Boston Celtics games in China. Now, I'm not going to get into the political debate around this. You can agree or disagree with Kanter and his statements, but at the end of the day, he was simply speaking his mind, which we all have the right to do. Kanter further doubled down on his sentiments towards China after appearing in interviews on Fox News and CNN, advocating to boycott the 2022 Winter Olympics, which was held in China. Now, shortly after Kanter started making all these claims regarding China, the Boston Celtics traded Kanter in a package deal to the Houston Rockets before the trade deadline in 2022, and then the Rockets waived Kanter shortly thereafter. And since then, no team has picked him up as a free agent. And that's when we get Kanter claiming that he was pushed out of the NBA because of his politics and viewpoints around China, and now he has been blacklisted from being able to play in the NBA. And more recently, you've seen him post stories of him lifting dumbbells with his shirt off, saying lawsuit loading, as if him being fit and in shape doing some bicep curls means he clearly can still play in the NBA, when in reality, Kanter just isn't good enough to play in the league anymore. Like, the man needs to figure out how to defend better than some dude at a 24-hour fitness pickup game before he can come at the NBA and claim he's being blacklisted because of his politics. No, dude, you just need to play better basketball. This is the highest level of professional basketball, and if you're not even going to give effort on the defensive end and your offense isn't what it used to be, you don't rebound as effectively as you did when you're in your prime, you're not as efficient operating in the paint, you can't shoot threes in an era of the NBA where that is paramount, and you don't space the floor because of your lack of shooting. If you can't do these things, you can't expect to play in the NBA, not when the talent pool in the league is at an absolute peak. What I actually don't understand is why Kanter isn't just playing professionally overseas, although I say that, but that's a whole other issue when it comes to Kanter having a bounty on him and a warrant for his arrest to have him extradited back to Turkey, but that's a topic for a different day. Or even just playing in the G League, which obviously won't happen now because he's trying to sue the NBA, but more so meaning after getting waived and not picked up by a team, spend some time in the G League to work on your game and get better. Instead, he's just focused on flexing in front of a mirror and making threats against the NBA, which the NBA has continually denied that he has been blackballed from the league and was fully in his right to speak on matters that he is passionate about. So look, at the end of the day, I don't have a problem with Kanter and using his freedom of speech to express political matters that are important to him. Like I said, the off-court stuff, none of that bothers me. What bothers me is you have a former NBA player who is simply not good enough to be in the NBA and is trying to turn this into something that it's not. A little more self-awareness on the part of Kanter would be nice instead of trying to remain in the spotlight and news with shock value comments and posts on social media. Either work on your game to get better and back into the NBA, or move on and be done with it. That's just my 2 cents though. Would love to hear what you guys think regarding Enes Kanter looking to sue the NBA. Let me know in the comments, and as always, be sure to subscribe, and I will catch you guys in the next one.